Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined us today. Today we have the wonderful privilege of bringing a very important conversation, which is the violence of gender essentialism, how law determines the health of gender diverse people. I've brought a wonderful array of experts to come and discuss this, a wonderful topic, an important topic with us. I am Letlhogonolo Mokgoroane. I am one of the commissioners of the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. And I don't think I have to explain further how this topic really fits into the work that we do at the Commission. And I'm really privileged to bring a wonderful array of speakers that will just blow us and help us understand more deeply this conversation. So I have the wonderful privilege of being in conversation with the current UN Special Rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who is also the former chair of the Coordination Committee of the Special Procedures Mandate holder during the 2022 and 2023 term. She's a distinguished lecturer at O'Neill Institute Center for and Global Health Policy and Politics, an extraordinary lecturer at Stellenbosch University. She's also the co-chair of this O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. Dr. Mofokeng has worked in various clinics and health management settings, as has intervened as an amicus curiae, which is a friend of the court, in many jurisdictions across the world in her capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur. Welcome, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. The next panelist is Mr. Victor, who also used to be the UN independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And Victor is currently also a practitioner in residence at Harvard Law School International Human Rights Clinic, where he works with students on projects relating to sexual orientation and gender identity. He's also a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, and since 2019, the Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher at the Human Rights Program. Welcome, Victor. And lastly, we also have Dr. Chamindra. Dr. Chamindra is the founder and trustee of the Consortium for Intersectional Justice, a transnational collective that focuses on strengthening how intersectional justice is understood in policymaking and international cooperation schemes. She's a human rights defender, researcher, and published author. In her activist and academic output, she's firmly conceptualized sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, human rights as an intersectional feminist priority. Her work has appeared in international peer-reviewed publication, and she's the author of the 2018 monogram Decolonizing Peace Building, Managing Conflict from Northern Ireland to Sri Lanka and Beyond. She's currently also a commissioner of the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. Welcome to my wonderful panelist. I wanted to begin to start this conversation that we have to get, but just setting a background, right? We know that we are existing in a kind of anti-rights movement. There's a lot of anti-gender law and a movement. We've seen the situation of Uganda and the court also upholding that law. We've also seen what's happening in Ghana. We've seen the imminence and discussions about a family protection bill in Kenya. We've seen kind of the array of legislation making its way through in the United States. And we've seen in countries where perhaps there has been rights-based approaches and kind of movements in these rights, that lives of gender diverse people, particularly in accessing healthcare, is a bit problematic. Victor, I wanted to start with you just to discuss kind of the prevalence and racial essentialism in the law across different contexts. I know that in your role as the former independent expert, you may have done some country versus and some reports. So may I ask you to just talk about kind of the prevalence of gender and racial essentialism in these different regions?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here in this conversation, which is essential to so many persons, communities, and peoples around the world. extremely privileged to be here. During my tenure as independent expert, but also previously with my work at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for example, where we dealt with colonial legislation in the Caribbean, it became very apparent that colonization entailed the imposition of systems of differentiation, hierarchization, and domination. And it is a normal feature that scholars are now suggesting that the presumed oneness of the colonized population was a fundamental trait of the way in which the systems were implemented. And invariably, there were categories of persons that the system relied on, establishing categories of persons. For example, a modernizing elite, or quote unquote elite, I should say, and a yet to be modernized peasantry. And the rise of the former is typical of colonial projects, seen in countries where the elite remained in power throughout all of the imposition of these models, and afterwards remained to continue implementing these models in sorts of continuation of the colonial project. We know that the colonial project actually utilized normative systems, and in particular pathologization, demonization, and criminalization as tools to actually erode existing structures of social fabric, and therefore ensuring the installation of the colonial project, which typically rested on certain political strategies, which include, of course, political homophobia. I think that part of what was very revealing in the research that I carried out in relation to the continued impact of colonialism in the construction and prevalence of social mores around sexual orientation and gender identity is that these heteronormative views that of sexuality instilled by colonial powers were inextricably linked to racist characterizations of gender and sexuality. And it is very much a working theory that we see fundamented by evidence that racialization of gender radically transformed colonized societies. And part of what I'm interested in doing is interrogating then all of these discourses that assume that normalization of sexuality and gender according to one mold would be part of the quote-unquote traditional values of certain contexts, including, of course, this is the arguments that we are seeing in Ghana. It's the argument that we're seeing in Uganda and in Kenya, to speak only of three examples in this this very pervasive trend that we have right now of recriminalization and further criminalization. I think what we need to interrogate in those questions is to what extent this is part of a narrative that has been adopted that instrumentalizes the lives of lesbian, of gay, bisexual, trans, otherwise gender diverse persons, and utilizes them to the service of a political project that, in my view, could very well be construed as continuing colonial domination, just in another form.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that. Dr. Mofokeng, I want to come to you. You've written in your current role as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health about racism and the right to health, and I think linked particularly to what Victor has spoken about. Your inquest in one of the reports is to think about the role of colonization and how we think about accessing the right to health, and particularly focusing on one sector, which is racialization. And I want us to speak a little bit about that, how kind of this idea of racializing and of colonialism impacts just generally a person's right to health, and then particularly people of gender diverse identities.
Thank you so much. And what a great build-up from Victor's intervention, because we know that in very much cis-heteronormative understandings, right, there is this idea that men and women are completely distinct physiologically, emotionally, and in their innate capacities, right, and that these differences are unchanging, and that there is a system, a social system, that rewards men and women who participate in society and adhere to these very strict boxes and what we call binaries of what it is to be a man and a woman. And so gender essentialism plays within that context of wanting to defend a binary and a very closed understanding of what it is to be truly human and experience the human life in its fullness. And the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, under the right to health, importantly, speaks about freedoms and the freedom to control and make decisions on one's body, on one's health, but importantly, that they must be free of violence, free of coercion, free of discrimination in reality and in practice. And these are key because when you think about the kinds of human rights violations that happen because of the gendered ways of understanding life and the way that power moves through all of us because of assigned expectations based on gender identity and expressions, we can see how, therefore, gender essentialism affects directly equal access to health facilities, to goods, and to services. And in fact, gender essentialism is in direct conflict with human rights because it breeds discrimination and allows a lot of the violations to happen without accountability and impunity, because people are already othered. They are already dehumanized by simply being and existing outside of what is expected. And we know that these very strict binary lenses are entrenched not only just in policy and law, but also in medicine. And that's why when I took on the role as being the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, I clearly articulated that I would be using anti-coloniality and anti-racism to analyze the state of where we are right now in the world and the realization of the right to health. But as a proposal and recommendations to move forward, I wanted to bring forward the idea of substantive equality, that indeed, if we do promote, protect, and respect the right to health, we are able to create the opportunity of equality of everyone everywhere, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation or race or any other grounds for discrimination, that they may be able to realize their right to health. Now, when it comes particularly to sexuality, we know that the control of sexuality and sexual expression, and particularly of women's sexuality, does have its origin in patriarchal oppression and something that I call patriarchal violence, because these are not just ideas that people have, right? Or just desires of controlling people. Patriarchal violence punishes people like we see in the ways the law, in the ways doctors, in the ways civil spaces are designed and engineered and are actually not protecting the right to health of everyone everywhere. And so we know, and like Victor says, colonialism has perpetuated the patriarchal control of societies and the control of sexuality, right? And the bodies of women and girls and gender diverse people have long been subjected to discrimination, to oppression, where human rights violations have also occurred unabated. And so there's a whole historical analysis of how our bodies are instrumentalized, right? And how, because of the obsession with fertility, those who are seen to be fertile are used politically for development of economies, for military expansion and domination around the world. And so when you're talking about gender essentialism, we have to talk about also the fact that we live in a world where the colonial and post-colonial regimes, in one hand, discourage fertility of people that they seem undesirable. But on the one hand, they encourage fertility and reproduction of communities and sets of people who they see as desirable. So there is a dehumanization of personhood that happens with gender essentialism. And so at the intersection of racism, you can then see how gender essentialism with racism, become a really a melting pot of what many of us experience as intersectional violence and systemic and structural violence. And so for me, the idea of ultimate freedom and what the right to health can offer is this idea that we all have a right to ultimately self-determine, and we must create societies that whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever your needs are, the system and society you are in should be able to support whatever decision you need to make, not police it, not surveil it, not discriminate and punish it for what it is, but support you to make the best decisions for you. And as a medic, I know firsthand how medicine in itself has contributed, unfortunately, to maintaining gender essentialism at all costs, right? And I know that the law and medicine, when they merge, can be a powerful tool in how we can move forward to redesign and reimagine a world where everyone everywhere can really realize their right to health outside of these very scripted lives we are expected to live through a binary approach of what it is to be a man or a woman.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Mofokeng. Dr. Chamindra, I want to bring you in here just to think about what both Victor and Dr. Mofokeng have said in relation to just the prevalence of gender and racial essentialism in the law, and particularly how it plays out. I want to know, in the work that you've done, how have you seen the prevalence of kind of this gender and racial essentialism?
Thank you, Letlhogonolo, for having me here. And yeah, thank you for that question as well. So to respond to that question, I'll take a little detour. There is a Guttmacher Lancet Commission report where I'm quoting the Lancet, where they say that this is about SRHR, so the Guttmacher Lancet Commission. And there is a statement there that high-income countries, the Commission has found out that high-income countries have largely instituted policies that favor holistic implementation of SRHR programs and services, whereas most low-income and middle-income countries are battling with the reality of prioritization in SRHR or simply offering lip service to it. And within brackets, it says that most of these countries are in Africa or Southeast Asia. And then this is followed by a discussion on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. That Lancet Commission finds that, okay, high-income countries have largely instituted policies that favor holistic implementation of SRHR. Now, if you think about the experience, the lived experience, let's say, of a woman of color from a migrant background battling immigration restrictions in one of those high-income countries, seeking to access SRHR services, imagine the challenges that you would have to undergo. If there is an indigenous woman in some of those high-income countries, because let's not forget that some of these countries classified that in the international system, some of these countries that are classified as high-income countries, these are also places that were declared in some cases terra nullius, and whereas those were entire continents full of rich cultures, people who've been living in those countries for thousands of years. So basically, countries built on genocide. So when we talk about genocide ongoing in today's world, when we think about acts of genocidal intent, those of us, wearing the kufi, we're not wearing it as just a political statement, right? It is a state of mind. It is a state of being. It is a way of questioning and a way of challenging these acts of genocidal intent, present and historic. So some of these high-income countries have been built on the concept of terra nullius, for example. And so indigenous people trying to access the so-called largely instituted policies that favor holistic implementation. Imagine the challenges that indigenous women would face, indigenous women in all their diversity, indigenous gender diverse people would face in those countries. So my point is this, my point is in the entire global health sector, there is a tendency for two things. One is platitudes. You look at, okay, global north, we have a certain number of policies that are grand, and low middle income countries, there is a, what was the language used there? Lip service, right? That most countries only simply offering lip service. So look at the dichotomy there, right? Global north grand, global south lip service. These things are completely dismantled, challenged by the work Victor did during his time as IESOG, and the work Dr. Mofokeng is doing as a mandate holder on the right to health. So Dr. Mofokeng rightly talked about the binary lenses through which we address these. We look at SRHR, patriarchal oppression, and the link between patriarchal oppression, racism, colonialism, acts of genocidal, colonialist acts of genocidal intent, and how all of this water down to control people's right to their bodily autonomy, especially women's rights to bodily autonomy, and by extension, the rights of indigenous people, the rights of gender diverse people, the rights of people with diverse sex characteristics to their bodily autonomy. So my point is, there are a couple of problems here. One is the compartmentalization of rights, because when you say in the international landscape, in the body of rights we know as women's human rights, go to any women's human rights conference, go to a discussion on SRHR. Is there a dialogue in there about gender diverse people? No. The conversation is extremely cis-normative. So then again, and if you look at a little bit further, is there a dialogue that delves into the depths of what it means to be intersectionally inclusive, beyond the platitudes, beyond saying, okay, we stand up for intersectionality, etc. Not that kind of language I'm talking about. I'm talking about going to the depth of things. Indigenous women, women with disabilities, women with, who face specific intersecting challenges that are caused by the intersections of lived experience, their position, that there would be considerable lacuna when it comes to discussions on these issues. So compartmentalization of rights. So if you go to the sector that we know as trans human rights, if you go to some of the events that are organized in this sector, the dialogue on SRHR is lacking. So you talk about trans health as if that were a monolith, right? So there's absolutely nothing to do. We have absolutely nothing to do between what we know as SRHR and what we know as trans health. It's as if you're talking about two different planets or something. And that is a big problem. I mean, that is a big reason why we can't, as French people say, on n'est pas sorti de l'auberge, as in we can't move forward. This is a system that is in place where bodies of rights are compartmentalized, and it's very tough. It's a tough call to build solidarity, build forms of understanding across these bodies of rights. What we know as SRHR, what we know as trans human rights, what we know as intersex human rights, what we know as anti-racist advocacy when it comes to public health, right? So it is very important that we identify these challenges in the sector of global health. The Lancet Commission on Racism and Structural Discrimination, one of the core goals that falls on our heads as commissioners is precisely this challenge. And then we talk about in terms of the UN structures, right? We talk about sustainable development. We talk about, there is a SGD for SRHR, Sustainable Development Goal. That is goal number 3.7. And again, if you look at goal number 3.7, you talk about universal access to SRHR services you talk about family planning, you talk about information and education, integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs and so on. I've sat at numerous occasions in my own country, Sri Lanka, and in a few other countries that I have close connections to, on national strategies, on SRHR issues. And in those spaces also, there is considerable gatekeeping when it comes to intersectionally inclusive approaches. And I'm not only talking about gender diverse people, because the problems gender diverse people face are not limited to the lived experience of gender diverse people. That level of exclusion exists, for example, in certain North American countries when it comes to indigenous people. The same level of exclusion exists when in certain countries in Oceania with regards to people at marginal intersections. So what we need to kind of come to terms with is the fact that for gender diverse people, access to health is marked by everything that my fellow panelists explained, all the challenges that were highlighted, that have been already highlighted: patriarchal oppression, racism, colonialism, the impacts of colonialism, and that there is no place really where you can access consistent health care for gender diverse people, because that's the topic of this event, right? This event specifically zooms in on gender diverse people. There is no place, absolutely no place anywhere in this planet where you can consistently access healthcare because for gender diverse people, because of the problems that I highlighted at the beginning, this compartmentalization of rights. So that is where we are at, and so it's miles to go before we get somewhere, like that Robert Frost poem, miles to go before I sleep. So it's very important that we kind of take stock of these challenges, especially, I mean, my next book, I'm working on my second book, it's called Feminism. It's very important for us to be conscious of how not only the right or the fascist movements out there, the sector of human rights, how the non-profit sector, how the international sector, how international institutions that focus on family planning, that focus on women's rights, that are supposed to focus on human rights, also have functional dynamics in place that infringe our rights and infringe our collective progress. When I say infringe our rights, I mean women's human rights. I mean the rights of minorities in all their diversities. Over to you, Letlho.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chamindra. You've said quite a wonderful mouthful, really food for thoughts. Dr. Mofokeng, I want to bring you in here, particularly thinking about how an essentialist legal environment, right, creates health-related vulnerabilities. I know that part of what you advocate for in your tenure as UN Special Rapporteur is that people are not inherently vulnerable. And so I've taken that to think about like essentialist legal environments creating these health vulnerabilities. For instance, if gender diverse people do not have access to legal gender recognition, it means that they are vulnerable in terms of that kind of sector. And that means that there may be issues in terms of barriers of access to healthcare. There may also be hostile environments at health facilities, but also there may be kind of lack of grievance redress mechanism. And I want to speak a little bit about hostile or essentialist legal environment and how they add to health-related vulnerabilities for gender diverse people.
So look, I think when you're talking about, the law and medicine, I think South Africa is a very interesting country in the many ways of good and bad ways, right? Of how the law and medicine can merge to really do amazing things. And also, unfortunately, when they merge to do very harmful things. But I do think that what we're dealing with now in the world is, coming from what Chamindra was saying, the global north countries, see themselves as the leaders of everyone on human rights. And yet, when you look within those countries, you will see, if there's disaggregated data, that there are still people who are marginalized, and most of those people are still people of various sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And it's important to pay attention to how countries collect data to what they value. So part of what's important for me is that you count and you quantify and you track what you value, because that will inform your policy direction. That will inform the kind of resource allocations and the budgets that you are making. And the law, I think, for me, is being used, especially criminal law, is being used in medicine as a weapon, right, to punish people, where you therefore have lost the potential and that important space where doctors and patients and their clients have that protected space to have these conversations and guide each other through various life stages, and what they need. And so when you then have the state who thinks that they are the authority that can decide where autonomy lies, and often for gender diverse people, at the back of patriarchal violence in a cis heteronormative society, the state wants to locate that autonomy outside of the individual. Hence, you have the laws and the bills that we see happening across the world that are anti-LGBTIQA plus rights. They are really driven by the idea that states unlegitimately, but they think they have a right to make those particular decisions for people. And I think where, for me, in terms of being a healthcare worker and a healthcare professional and a medical doctor, it's having these conversations with my own colleagues to say, you need to interrogate the system of medicine that you have inherited, which in itself, in the way we are taught it, in the methods of teaching, in the pedagogy, but also in the ways in which medicine experimentation and coercion has happened, impacts still the level of trust that patients have in us, right? To be able to say that I may be experiencing different or particular difficulties in other areas of my life, but in this one protected space, in this moment in time, when I am at this health facility, I know that I'm going to meet a healthcare worker who is not just empathetic, but who is driven by an ultimate commitment to protecting and promoting human rights, who understand the practice of medicine in itself as an act of defending human rights, because we are up against things like gender essentialism, which have no place in human rights, which have no place in medical practice. But what you have seen, the courts are now the battlefield for where decisions are being made about our bodies, about our fertility, about who is seen as the correct person or the desired population, right? And so these pro-natalist policies that we see happening at the back of what used to be called development, economic growth, we must also not forget how foreign policy and international solidarity through global health aid often perpetuates gender essentialism, often perpetuates neocolonialism. And so my approach to the right to health mandate is to also question this health financing and what it restricts and doesn't restrict, and what it enables, and also what it also enables in terms of rights violations. And this idea, as an example, how in the United States, the money, the aid money, the Presidential Emergency Fund for HIV relief is weaponized, because by getting that money, you are therefore not able to then give access to abortion care. But a lot of my patients who need abortion are trans people, right? And so what does it mean, therefore, when a foreign policy impacts what I do on the ground as a clinician? It's incomprehensible that one man in the White House can decide how I must practice medicine in Johannesburg and can decide the terms of what that consultation looks like and goes against my own medical and ethical training. It's absurd, and yet it happens. But where the hypocrisy of the world is, and of all of us is when Donald Trump started campaigning in his previous campaign. He turned foreign policy into domestic policy. And for the first time, Americans experienced what foreign policy actions have been happening in the global South, but domestically. Hence, you had the Women's March. Hence, you had all of the different advocacy moments around, you know, the passing of the HER Act and all of the different ways, right, of feminist organizing in the US. But my appeal is one. We cannot wait for situations to affect us personally before we take a principled approach on what is wrong and what is right. And so we must understand that if we are going to talk about justice, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, land justice, this is justice for one person. You can't put or cut up a person into different categories and then decide which human rights of that person you are going to then protect and assist in realizing. And so for me, gender essentialism is dangerous because it's part of the spectrum for me of imperialism. It's part of the spectrum for me of colonialism. And people use feminist languages and they weaponize it in those very gender essentialism discussions, right? And so these conversations we are having today are very important because we need to take back that space and bring forth these arguments and push back, but also push forward in what it is that we are trying to create. What is this world? And I think that's why the O'Neill Lancet Commission is important, because for me, when I think about a future that we are going towards, that we are moving towards, it can't be a future that still operates within a cis heteronormative framing of an understanding of a world and of how solutions of the world will come about. For me, queer theory and queerness is a political state of mind. It's a political way of being in the world. And we need to understand how absolutely empowering it is for all of us to be able to benefit from the work of activists who are doing work in queer activism. Because it means when they can ultimately self-determine and live free of coercion and violence and the threats of violence, it enables all of us to be able to do the same thing. And that's why I'm so passionate, right, about thinking much more deeper and broadly about dignity. Because a lot of what happens with gender essentialism is a stripping away of the dignity of people. The very essence of who you are is being stripped away every single day without accountability. I'm going to stop here, but you know, I've given you a mouthful, but that's where I'm at. There is a lot, and I must declare that this issue it's very personal to me in many different ways. And for many different reasons. But I do believe that the future that we are co-creating cannot be still bound and defined by cis heteronormative ideas and imagination. Our imagination has to be much more broader than that. And queer theory and queer politics and understanding and rooting ourselves in that, for me, will lead us to the ultimate freedom where everyone everywhere can be who they want to be in their own terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. A passionate answer, Dr. Mofokeng. Victor, I want to come to you. In some of the work that you've done as the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and also sex characteristics, what have you found has been some of the kind of legal arguments, right, or instruments or theories that have been used to further entrench essentialist laws? So what are people saying? What's the reason for there to still be this essentialist legal system?
Well, I think that all throughout what Tlaleng and Chamindra have been unpacking, and I think the word unpacking is very good here. We're looking at different dimensions of how this problem manifests. We are identifying certain number of common lines about the way in which power has been exercised to the service of an overarching goal, right? The overarching goal is the domination. I think Tlaleng was very clear. Domination of wombs is a particular telling trait of all of these strategies. And a fundamental part of these strategies, given that they rely on the notion of power of national states, because that is the very context in which this power is manifesting and creating, is all of the structural barriers to the enjoyment of rights, and in this particular discussion, to health inequality, all of the drivers of health inequality, at some point touch base into the use of normative systems at the service of the establishment of those barriers. And I'm interested in establishing here certain differences of the way in which this operates. There are such things as state-perpetrated direct acts of violence and discrimination in the form, for example, of criminalization. We all know that the exercise of the death penalty, for example, in relation to persons of diversity, is a direct arbitrary killing. And that is directly the use of criminal legislation to the purpose of ensuring the permanence of a particular standard. And we know that direct use of criminal law is a feature that still is present in 67 countries. It is enormously lamentable that we are seeing an entrenchment and a further exercise of criminalization in certain African countries, driven by no small part by regression that is financed and supported from the United States, for example. So all of these issues actually connect with each other. We also know that pathologization has been present all throughout history, and it has carved deep grooves in the awareness of health personnel and the health profession. I think Tlaleng was very clear in talking about the presence constantly of health professionals that still think, as of today, that same-sex intimacy is a crime or a pathology that needs to be diagnosed. And of course, I don't think we need to go even that far when it comes to the pathologization of certain forms of gender identity. I don't think I can actually restrict examples to 2 hours of the many cases in which I visited countries in which health personnel that I interviewed were absolutely convinced that these were pathologies that needed to be diagnosed and cured. And it leads me to, I would say, 2 directions in relation to this issue. There are certain traits in the way that this manifests itself, all of these structural drivers, and then they go and spill over to factors of exclusion. Certain lines are very clear. We've talked about health providers, we've talked about systems, sexual and gender-based violence, not only in healthcare settings, but connected to the health sector as such. The impact of the denial of recognition of gender identity is a fundamental driver of exclusion. It is very clear that trans men have a particular barrier when it comes, for example, to accessing gynecological services in any settings. I've had many examples of trans men who had not seen by a doctor in years because they simply feared going to any healthcare setting because they knew that they would be subject to violence and discrimination. And then I think that there are other things that we need to bear very much in mind. The restrictions on organizations that are working on issues concerning sexual orientation and gender identity are a fundamental driver of the way in which this whole system is implemented, as is the lack of appropriate and non-discrimination health information. So all of these issues, I think, in my view, create a setting where we need to attack structural drivers, their manifestations, and their consequences. But let me mention that I think this connects in a very telling way also with the vicissitudes of political power. Tlaleng was mentioning the way in which a certain election can change the course, not only of domestic policies, but also of international policy. We all know that at the change of every election in the United States, from Republican to Democrat, the global gag rule actually comes into play as a political tool. And this has very specific consequences in the way that this system is actually used. To me, all of this leads to a need to ensure not only of a recognition of the deep and inextricable connection that the eradication of violence and discrimination actually has with the recognition of sexual orientation and gender identity as points of entry into this analysis, but also very important, the recognition that this is a task that is also inextricably linked to social justice, to racial justice, and its consequence in the use of intersectional approaches. And just to say one last sentence in relation to that, many public policy makers know the principal statement of using intersectional approaches and frameworks as part of the analysis, but what we need to demand is that this goes beyond a principle and methodological statement, and it actually drives into programmatic and operational structures so that we are gathering data that actually is allowing us to look in the way in which all of these factors are interacting to place persons, the majority of persons, in situation of exacerbated exposure to risk and violence. Like Tlaleng, I don't believe in populations, communities of persons being inherently vulnerable. I believe that populations, communities, and persons are placed in situations of exposure to risk, which oftentimes manifest themselves in reality because of the particular identities that they reunite in one body.
Thank you so much, Victor. I know the four of us could chat all night, but we know that there are participants who have been listening to the wonderful remarks you've been making, and so it would be remiss of us not to get some of their questions answered. So I'll go to a number of the questions that have been asked on the question and answer platform. In order not to misgender anyone, I'm going to use the singular they, them, gender neutral pronoun to refer to the people who've asked the questions. I'll just say their name, but in case I needed to use a pronoun, I'll just use the singular they, them pronoun. Susanna asks, thanks so much for this very rich discussion, even early on. Could you discuss the rising concept of gender apartheid and how it does instill or rely on gender essentialism? If so, how do we disentangle the very real issues that gender apartheid is attempting to isolate and address? I don't know if anyone wants to take that question, but that's one of the questions that, the discussion about the concept of gender apartheid and how it relies on gender essentialism. And if so, how do we disentangle it from the very real issues that gender apartheid is attempting to isolate and address? That's the first question. The second question is from Cherie, T. Cherie. They ask, this is a great discussion. Do any of you think that medical organization and medical health systems will be intentional in seeking out impacted person to help restructure the systems of care? I suppose that's a really wonderful question, and someone else can answer that question. Then we have another one from Monica. The question is, what would the integration of the theory of social construction of gender look like inside medical school curriculum? Would it be ideal to include an entire course and/or train educators to integrate these ideas in their lectures? So I'll start with those three questions for now, and then we will there's other two questions. But may I ask anyone who's inclined to answer? The first one relates to the gender apartheid question. The second one is about the intentionality of mental health systems in seeking out impacted persons to restructure systems of care. And the last one is in relation to changing and including gender in the medical school curriculum. I see Victor's unmuted, so Victor, I think you'll go first.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think I'm going to feel very much foolish by engaging with Susanna Friel in the conversation concerning gender apartheid, because I really recognize the complexities of that very specialized discussion, which, as we know, is a burning question that is being discussed at the moment in the context of United Nations deliberations. I don't know that I have a fully comprehensive answer for Susanna, at least not one that does justice for the issue, but I'd like to just mention that I am engaging with that issue from the point of view of my research and my own creation of my own opinion. And I'm taking as point of departure 3 building blocks. One is the letter that was presented to the International Law Commission by a number of special procedures mandate holders, where we advocated for the inclusion of gender and gender persecution in the draft Convention on Crimes Against Humanity, and the importance that that definition of gender go beyond, of course, the very superated, I could say, definition in the Rome Statute, but actually ensure that it includes forcefully this notion of gender as that system of stereotypes and domination that we know it to be. In that context, I think that what I am focusing on around the concept of gender apartheid, which of course has been worked so profusely by the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan and the Working Group on Women and Girls in their work on the matter, is the way in which the notion of groups and group would actually interact with the way in which people self-identify in sexual orientation and gender identity. Because my experience in relation to this issue is that, of course, we have an acronym, but we know that the acronym has enormous lacks in answering to the way people understand and recognize themselves in the context in which they live. And therefore, the question to me, which I'm yet to define, is how would that very ambitious and very real appetite that there is to acknowledge the reality of what we would end up calling in international law as gender apartheid, how it would recognize this idea of groups as applied to sexual orientation and gender identity, given that the recognizability or identification of the group is an essential part of the way in which this concept is made in international human rights law.
Thank you so much, Victor. Dr. Chamindra, I think you'd wanted to take another question.
Thank you, Letlhogonolo. So very quick one on the gender apartheid one. We need to collectively express full solidarity with the daughters of Afghanistan, right? When you talk about gender apartheid, right? And let's also not forget the international politics of this. The so-called advocates of feminist foreign policy and the so-called advocates of human rights and those who police global South countries on human rights issues, they are the enablers of gender apartheid because the international community as such, when you say conflict studies, when you say in international relations, when you say international community, you're referring to the NATO region, right? You're referring to the global north as we know it. And this international community has created an enabling environment to make sure that gender apartheid happens in 2024. And what we need to remember is that there is an enabling environment. So if it happens to the daughters of Afghanistan, it's not too long before it happens to our daughters anywhere else in the world as well. All right, like Dr. Mofokeng rightly said, right? We can't wait till these issues become issues that concern only ourselves. So there is a need to critically question the international politics surrounding this. Victor talked about the UN mechanisms and that, but to critically engage with feminist foreign policy, to come to terms with the fact that there is no such thing. There is absolutely no such thing in the world today as a feminist foreign policy. It is a soft power. What we know as feminist foreign policy is a carefully, cautiously crafted soft power agenda to execute the power politics of wealthy global North nations with antecedents of colonialism, colonial oppression. That is what it is. There is no such thing as feminist foreign policy. So we need to critically engage with the international politics of this to deal with this question of gender apartheid. And the other one, medical logs and mental health systems will be intentional in seeking systems of care. So well, being intentional, once again, we need to address the core concerns of how the medical system functions, okay? We live in a system that we inherit from Marion Sims. We inherit this, the medical systems we know from very invasive, very discriminatory practices, medical experiments, practices imposed upon marginalized people. So we need to come to terms with these persistent, the present day legacies, these intergenerational continuities of medical racism and racialized violence and gender-based violence in medical racism, to critically engage with this kind of question. And the more we question, the more we work towards dismantling medical racism, the more we will work towards, the more we'll be able to move towards that kind of engagement, the way it was mentioned in that question. I'm afraid I can't find that question anymore. So there we are. So medical logs and mental health systems. So the more we move forward with the mandate of this Lancet Commission, for example, the more we'll be able to meet things halfway on the bridge. Over to you, Letlhogonolo.
Thank you so much. And I love the idea of care systems rather than like hospitals, right? Dr. Mofokeng, I'm wondering, and I know this is something that you're passionate about, right? Which is the integration of theories of social constructions of gender inside a medical school curriculum. And ideally, what would that look like? So the question is either should it be an entire course on its own or a training of educators to integrate these ideas in their lectures?
We need a whole paradigm shift in terms of understanding the health system and health provision and healthcare. Firstly, we need a different pedagogy at just period, right, in medicine. And part of the work that I do in South Africa is supporting doctors and healthcare workers in what I call transformational leadership, where I introduce them to human rights and the right to health, and how in their daily work they can start to infuse very important key principles of human rights, and showing them that in fact human rights are very real and tangible and not just abstract, right? On the one hand. On the second thing is that we need to also ensure that the curriculum itself interrogates its own history and its own creation as a science. A lot of the experimentation that has happened in medical science and discovery, we understand it very much around Black women and racism. But can you imagine the untold stories that queer people have gone through in the health system? If you think about the ways in which intersex children are born and are already decided for them what surgical interventions they are going to undergo so that they can fit a particular binary of what it is to have particular genitalia and therefore bind them to a particular social construct of what it is to be either a boy or a girl. That's one of the very first things we do as medical doctors. When a child is born, we say, oh, look at the genitals. Is it a boy or a girl? We need to get out of those kinds of practices, which for us and for many of my colleagues, they seem like just part of everyday life, celebrating a birth. But when you understand the politics, when you understand how harmful it is, that from the very moment a person is born, we are all fixated on their genitalia and therefore assign particular expectations based on that, and go a step further, creating laws and policies that punish them because they don't adhere to that. One of the tasks that I have as a doctor is to fill out a birth certification. That birth certification only gives me two options. Is it a boy or is it a girl? Fundamentally, that is wrong. And so unless doctors themselves see themselves as advocates for patients' rights, we will still have a very slow progress within the medical system. Because even those who know, they will tell you that administratively, I'm still bound to do things in a particular way. But where is the advocacy? Where is the activism to change the system? In another way, when you're thinking about medicine and gender essentialism, we need to think about innovation, right? Research and development in medicine. We already know that research and development for sexual and reproductive health is already underfunded. But we also know that all of the ways in which the needs, if you think about gender-affirming healthcare, if you think about the surgical interventions that are required, the medical commodities and supplies required, they are seen as if we are asking the system to do an extra service. They are seen as a burden to the system. They are seen as aesthetic requirements. But when doctors understand the intersection of the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul, in how you experience life, and how we can be supportive of people to truly be who they are and when they want to be, we can really be transformational as doctors. But we don't understand that because medicine tells us that we are God's favorite, we are the creme de la creme, we know everything, and with that mighty stethoscope, we can then make decisions on people's lives and decide for them what is good. So we need this paternalistic approach to medicine to also end. And the only way to end that is for doctors to actually understand human rights, to understand they are for themselves why practicing medicine from a human rights perspective and using those principles actually enables them to be better doctors, to get better health outcomes. And yes, of course, human rights will always be a language of obligations, which is good because it enables accountability. You were speaking earlier about redress. What do we do when things go wrong? For many people, when things go wrong, there's absolutely no accountability because you don't want to engage with that very system that was harmful to you again, to appeal to your humanity to be seen and recognized in the first place. So we need to really think about the medical or the health system as part of a social system. What happens in health facilities is often a mirror of the society in which it serves, but also the society should be able to hold us accountable to the kinds of challenges and obstacles that we keep creating, you know, and I suppose not allowing them to be fully themselves. And so my thing is always that my own colleagues, I hold them accountable to the fact that they are not interrogating the science of medicine that they've inherited. They are not interrogating the impact of how the practice of that science has on people. And so it's a very hard task when the medical schools are so controlled by the deans and by the heads of institutions, which are often white men, right? Who for them, heteronormativity and patriarchal ideas are just the way life is. So everything I bring to the table is seen as combative. It's seen as a battle and a fight. So it takes a long time of advocacy, which is why we must support human rights workers. We must support advocacy. We must support the work of human rights mainstreaming and ensuring that human rights are at the compass for us all, and really also hold global funders to this obsession with programs. How many HIV tests did you do with men having sex with men? How many HIV tests did you do, or PrEP did you give to particular population groups? We need to get out of this biomedical only paradigm of how we practice medicine and think about medicine as a social system within itself that can enable people to also realize economic, civil, political, and economic, rights as well. But when things go wrong within the medical system, it's incredibly unfair to expect the very same patient who's dehumanized by the system to be the one to summon the strength to take on the system again for accountability. So what does accountability and redress look like, therefore, in a world where we know we need reparative justice, we need to restore each other's dignity, we need the bonds between us as individuals, us and the state, us and the government, us and the broader community to be better? What does that look like? And I think the Commission provides us that opportunity to co-create, to co-vision, and allow ourselves the creativity and the space to really reimagine a world that for many people may seem unattainable. But I remain unreasonably optimistic that we can get it right and that we can get to a point of substantive equality. And the right to health for me as a framework is really important because it just doesn't talk about accessing healthcare. It talks about underlying determinants of health, and absolutely health is political in the very ways that my colleagues Victor and Chamindra have also illustrated today. And just to say that I have an intellectual crush on all of you on this platform, and I think I can say that because I love you all so deeply, and thank you for doing this with us, for us, and it is about creating the work and a future where all of us can thrive and merely not just survive.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. We have two more questions and then I will release everyone. The first question is, in public health data generations, what items, questions, and responses sets does the panel think are the most useful for capturing diversity of sex, gender, and sexuality? Anyone can indicate whether they want to answer it. And then the other question is from Daniel. They write, gay rights in Africa have been turned into political topics whereby governments are using hate speech towards the LGBTI community to gain political mileage. Are there any plans or efforts to challenge these bad practices, especially in Uganda, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia? And then I just wanted to say there is a comment which it would be remiss of me not to read. It says, this panel has been so powerful. We're using the storytelling at Georgetown University, SOM and SON, and beyond to illuminate the stories about gender diverse patients' experiences in the healthcare system. This is affecting. This has been a mode of advocacy. So the first question is about kind of in public health data generation, what items do the panel think about capturing the diversity of sex, gender, and sexuality? And the second question is about the plans or efforts to challenge these bad practices in countries like Uganda, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. Victor, you may go ahead.
I'd like to just very quickly talk about the topic of data, because I did work on this in one of the thematic inquiries that I carried out. I think that it's very important to recognize that because this is an issue that in which such systems are put in place to victimize persons, a do no harm and risk assessment approach is absolutely essential when devising systems of data capture. And we're not only talking about the realities of countries in which the legislation is actually directly hostile and perpetrating itself human rights violations, such as context of criminalization, but also contexts in which the vicissitudes of political change can actually bring about bad use of data because of political change. We've given the example of shifting governments in which the use of data, in which people would have disclosed in good faith to a government that was progressive in relation to their rights, would be absolutely disastrous in the hands of a system that is regressive in relation to the rights. So a long-term do no harm and very much reliant on issues such as lawful use of data, transparency, accountability, and impartiality is absolutely fundamental. I'd like also to just add that because it is important that one does not reproduce the dynamics of colonialism, perceptions that are perhaps not fully supportive or respectful of the way in which people self-identify, I think self-determination is a fundamental principle in data gathering, and therefore participation of involved communities and peoples is absolutely a must. It is my experience that people identify themselves in ways that are, of course, not at all corresponding to acronyms or particular perceptions that we have in mind, and therefore it's absolutely essential that we understand that that definition is necessary. I think participation of communities that are concerned, persons, communities, populations, is the key to a system that is sustainable, that is respectful, and that complies with what we could actually recognize as a human rights-based approach to data gathering and management.
Thank you so much, Victor. Before I let us go, I just wanted to know if each of the panelists have like kind of one sentence, not more than one sentence, please, panelists, just in relation to, you know, food for thought that we want to leave all the our participants with in thinking about this topic. I'll start with you, Dr. Chamindra.
One sentence, you said?
One sentence, please.
One sentence. So we need to be conscious of intersecting challenges when it comes to global health advocacy, and look at how different realities are interconnected. Sectors of work, realities that we might be conditioned to consider as different are interconnected. There you go.
Thank you very much. I loved how your one sentence had many commas and parentheses. Dr. Mofokeng, any closing remarks? One sentence.
Let's co-create and co-vision a world that makes us feel truly alive and human and connected, and that perhaps we may not have all of the answers, but we know that what we have currently isn't working. And so let us be brave to go into the world and to listen to what people want, to listen to what people say for them a dignified life looks like, and take the lead and take the marching orders from the people who are already surviving life at the very margins of society, because they already have to survive. Whether or not we come or we don't come, they are already surviving their daily lives. And so let's listen, let's pay attention, let's learn, but let's center, for me, ultimately, the restoration of people's dignity, because that's really, really important as a first step to rehumanizing ourselves in a world that is hell-bent to dehumanize and ultimately extinguish us.
Thank you very much. If this was an exam question, I think most people would have gotten 0, because the one sentence is a paragraph. Victor, final closing remarks?
I'm gonna do what I always do, which is I try to be a good student. My one sentence is listen to Tlaleng and Chamindra.
Thank you so much. A really special thank you to the O'Neill Institution and also to the O'Neill Lancet Commission for giving us this platform to be able to discuss these really important topics. But more importantly, a very special thank you to all the panelists today. Victor, Dr. Chamindra, and Dr. Mofokeng, you've been absolutely wonderful. I am certain that we will go away chewing a little bit more on what you've let us. So thank you, everyone. We hope you have a wonderful evening if you are having an evening, a wonderful afternoon if you are enjoying an afternoon, and a wonderful morning for those of you who are having a morning. Until we meet again, be safe and listen to all the panelists. Thank you so much.